Hello, this is the first of a set of videos for the ethics section of WJEC Eduqas A-Level Religious Studies. Today we're looking specifically at divine command theory. Okay, now what is divine command theory? DCT is a meta-ethical theory that seeks to ground morality in God or a God. So the word meta-ethical refers to the field of ethics where we seek to define ethical terms. So we're asking questions like what is good, what is evil, what is right, what is wrong. And DCT provides an answer for this in saying that those questions find themselves answered in God. God himself is the source of morality. There have been several prominent defenders of divine command theories. We have people like Augustine, displayed down below, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, and in the modern day, people like Robert Adam, whose modified divine command theory we'll look at later on, and his image is also displayed, and Philip Quinn. Here's a simple definition of DCT. DCT states that any action X which God commands is morally good or right, and any action Y that God forbids is morally bad or wrong. So if we recall the field of meta-ethics, and we ask the question, what is good, what is wrong, what is right, what is evil, etc., we could say, okay, good equals what God commands, bad or wrong equals what God forbids. And that's effectively what DCT is in a nutshell. Now, since God commands things and forbids certain things, we as his creatures, we as human beings, have a duty or an obligation to obey him. And if we do this, if we listen to his commands and we do as he pleases, then we're being moral. And if we don't, then we're being immoral. So again, God is a centre of morality for proponents of divine command theory. He is the origin and regulator of morality, and he is the metaphysical foundation of it, meaning good and evil exist, and they exist as a result of or have their meaning in God. So there are a certain amount of phrases or characteristics that we can ascribe to this theory. The first one is that it is absolute. So there are certain rights and wrongs that are always so, right? It doesn't matter what the circumstance is, it's just right and wrong. So stealing is right or wrong. I guess most would say it's wrong, regardless of the circumstance. Some might have issues with that and say, well, hang on a minute, what if you need to steal to get some food so that you don't starve to death? Some might rebut with that point. But generally, divine command theorists believe that there are immutable right and wrongs, right? These actions are right, these ones are wrong, and you just can't get around it. Morality under DCT is also objective. So the distinction between objective and subjective when it comes to morality means, okay, does morality exist in me? Do I determine what it is, my preferences, my opinions? That's subjective morality. Or does it exist external to me, somewhere outside? And it's therefore objective. And divine command theorists favour the latter. They say that morality does not exist based on me. I don't create morality. It exists outside of me by what God's will is or his command. And so therefore it's an objective form of morality. It's also deontological, and that seems like a big word, but all it means is that we have certain duties, that morality is a case of duties rather than consequences. So lots of ethical theories state that we do good things or we avoid bad things so that we can maximize or so that we can have good consequences. Divine command theorists do not look at least for the most part, what the consequences of an action will be. Instead of looking at the consequence, they look at the action itself and say, okay, do we have a duty to do this action, or do we have a duty to not do this action? And for many, they'll say, okay, let's say God commands a certain action, therefore it's an intrinsically good action, and we have a duty to do it. And so we could classify DCT as a deontological ethical theory as well. Now, in terms of links to other ethical theories, we could contrast it with several, really. Utilitarianism is the view that we ought to do that action which produces the most good for the most number of people. So we can see that is a consequentialist theory, meaning it looks at the consequences of actions rather than the actions itself. So the means can be justified for the ends. Whereas DCT will say, no, it doesn't matter what the consequences will be, we have to just look at the act and see whether or not that act is morally right or wrong. So DCT on the one hand is deontological, and utilitarianism is consequentialist. Another example of a deontological ethical theory is Kant's ethical theory, which is quite interesting to look into, but we don't need to know that for now. We could also contrast DCT with situation ethics. Because situation ethics is not absolute. It's relative, as the name situation suggests, right? It looks at the situation and says, okay, which action should I do that will produce the most loving, which will use the most love, or agape. DCT and proponents of this theory would actually say it doesn't really matter the situation, we just have to look at what God commands and make our decision based on that. Now, if we think that God is omnipotent, meaning he is all-powerful, or if people who believe in this theory do, then it follows, or at least it would seem to follow, that he has total sovereignty, freedom and control over the universe and over us as his creatures. So it seems to flow from this the idea of divine command theory, that he chooses willingly to govern his creatures in the world according to a set of divine laws, which we as humans ought to obey. It would be foolish, if there is a God, for us to just ignore whatever God's commands are, right? There's a lot that we have to lose if we ignore him or if we go against his commands. So an example of this would be obviously the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, where as a result of disobeying God's commands, Adam and Eve are cast out from the garden and they lose immortality, they lose eternal life. So as humans, what we have a duty to do is to just find out what God commands and just literally blindly obey it. Right, do what he says, because we are in no position to speak up against him, effectively, is what proponents of this theory will argue. Now, we have to distinguish as well between two forms of divine command theory. The strong form states that basically God commands specific ethical actions. He's very precise as to what he says. Okay, so these minute details of God's law you have to obey. Whereas the weak form is a bit more sort of hands-off. And effectively what God does under this framework is he gives a set of boundaries and moral laws that determine the scope of morality. And then we as free creatures have to determine how those laws, those sort of general laws, can be applied to specific situations. So he's not looking at the insignificant aspects of moral actions here, but rather just in general morality. So do not steal, do not harm others. And then we as free humans can determine, okay, what does that mean for the specific action? Whereas the strong form will be more sort of rigid and say, these are the specific commands you have to follow. Okay, there are several strengths of divine command theory as well. The first one being that divine command theory aligns with God's omnipotence and sovereignty, as he is the ultimate source of morality. So this solves the grounding problem of ethics, right? Many people will say, or they'd like to believe, that there are certain things which are just right and certain things which are just wrong. And maybe it's difficult to see where that idea comes from, right? There are many who believe that is just an expression of emotion or desire, or what is good just is the case. But many would like to find a foundation for that and say, well, we like to maintain moral rightness and wrongness, but where does that come from? What is the grounding of that? And for many, the answer is most satisfactorily found in God, especially for religious believers. And bear in mind that the majority of the world is religious. We have billions of Christians and Muslims and Jews and people of other religions. And many of them will actually see DCT as an ethical theory that is consistent with their religion. Unlike things like utilitarianism and some would say, motivism, etc., which we'll look at later. Those don't really align with their religion, whereas DCT possibly could. So there's a link there with religion that many believers could accept. It's also absolute and objective, so it can't change, right? You just have this moral law, and you just go by it, right? You can't contest it. There's no sort of ambiguity, and therefore it's good. Now, this is an odd strength, because this could be a strength or it could be a weakness, right? Some are going to say, well, actually, having an absolute theory is not a strength, because what about ethical dilemmas and situations which require more compassion? Or people are going to deny that morality is objective and instead say it's just an expression of personal desire. And also, some might negate the premise that actually God's laws can't be changed. Obviously we have, for example, in the Old Testament, the commandments that were given to the Jewish people, but then many Christians, for example, will believe that now there's a new law with Christ and that there are new commands, or that the old ones have been fulfilled and some of them are no longer applicable or relevant. So this idea that the laws of God don't change, or that they aren't always applicable, is not accepted by all religious believers anyway. Another strength that is quite appealing for many proponents of the theory is that DCT is universal. So everyone at all places and at all times can know by referring to some sort of revelation what God, the creator of that person and of us all, wants you to do in a certain situation. Or if you're going with the weak form, at least they can know what is just generally what is right and wrong, and they can use their conscience to determine how to apply that in a specific situation. So we have a greater assurance, and we're not left in the dark as to what to do. If we have God, our creator, telling us what to do or giving us more guidance, then that can help. It also emphasizes the virtue of obedience. Now, whether or not obedience is a virtue is something that there's debate about, right? Many would consider this a good thing because you listen to God. You have, like you obey your parents, you're obeying your creator, your heavenly Father, who tells you what to do. And some would see that as a strength, others would see that actually as weakness, and you're sort of submitting yourself to a higher power. And why don't you have your individuality and just do what you want? Ethical egoism is going to say later on, we shouldn't sort of restrict ourselves to following these sources of morality and sources of authority that are not ourselves. We only have ourselves, so why don't we just listen to ourselves? But for many, this is a virtue, or it can be a vice. Now let's look at the challenges to divine command theory as well, because there are several of these as well. There's a lot more challenges than there are strengths, admittedly. The first one, and the most famous one, is referred to as the Euthyphro dilemma. So Plato, who was one of the original philosophers from ancient Greece, had a dialogue called Euthyphro, in which Socrates is arguing with a man named Euthyphro all about morality. So Euthyphro claims that piety, which is just an old term for goodness, is what is pleasing to the gods. So Socrates asks him, what do you mean by good? Or what do you mean by morality, goodness, piety? And Euthyphro responds with, well, it's what's pleasing to the gods. In response, Socrates gives this most famous line. He says, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? So take a moment to take that in. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? So do the gods just come and say, okay, we're going to love this pious thing because it's pious? Or does it become pious particularly because it's loved by the gods? And this is what we refer to as the Euthyphro dilemma, which has the two horns, right? The first half of the statement is the first horn, and the second half is the second horn. And both, according to many people, appear to be problematic for a believer in divine command theory. Well, the first horn, that the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious, seems to be very off when it comes to DCT. Because it's sort of like, okay, you have this thing over here, which is the pious, the good, and they have the gods over here, and they choose to love the pious because it's pious. But remember that DCT said that God is the source of piety. So we can't have this separation, right? It would imply in a way that morality is independent from God, whereas DCT claims that actually morality is founded in God. God is the source and origin of morality. So we have to reject the first horn. But with the second horn, there are many, many more issues. The first issue is known as the arbitrariness problem. So, if the good is good solely because God commands it, right? So, piousness or goodness is just determined because God commands it, right? Then why couldn't anything just be moral, right? There isn't really an objective standard of morality if God could just command anything, and because he commanded it, therefore it's good. Effectively, what this does is it reduces morality to arbitrariness, right? It's like God just chooses one day and says, okay, this action is going to be good, this one's going to be wrong, and this one's going to be good as well. And then, okay, why is that the case? Couldn't he have done it the other way around? Is it possible that we could be in a world where God commands things like stealing and killing, and therefore they're good, and things like charity and, altruism are actually bad? According to divine command theory, and the second horn of the dilemma, if good is simply good just because God commands it, then how can we really escape this arbitrary problem? So there's a good quote here from a man named J. Bagini, who said that, well, actually, God is the greatest relativist of them all. Because, remember we said earlier that DCT is actually absolute. Well, what about when it comes to God and him deciding what is morally right and wrong, if he decides, right? Then how does he decide? Doesn't he decide that relative to things? And doesn't he, he determines by himself. So it's subjective in a way as well, and it's relative because there's no like absolute standard. He just determines what it is, and it's not really a strict set of laws. He just determines whatever, and it could be whimsical. It's arbitrary. We don't know what it is. That's the first objection. The second issue with the second horn is the abhorrent commands objection. So if morality is arbitrary, as we were saying earlier, if God just commands whatever, and there seems to be no reason behind it, then theoretically God could command an evil act, or at least what we perceive now to be evil. So if God were to command things like adultery and murder, these would become morally right. That doesn't seem right though, does it? Just because God commands something, including things like murder and adultery, does that really make them right? Wouldn't they be wrong? So Cubworth argues that this is a possibility. So he rejects this as absurd, right? Like if it's possible to say God could command adultery or God could command murder, then and that would make it right, then surely DCT is absurd. So an example that you could give is the Akedah, which is when God commands Abraham to slaughter his son Isaac in Genesis 22. Does this make murder right? Well, obviously later on someone can respond with God intervenes and he stops him from killing his son, so it wasn't actually God like commanding murder as a good thing. But what if we lived in a different universe where the true God gave us commands that we would consider morally abhorrent? Would that make them right? It would seem not. And the final issue with the second horn is that morality loses its meaning. So if whatever God commands is good, simply because God commands it, then when we say God's commands are good, what we're doing is a tautology. A tautology means a statement which is effectively repeating itself, that there is no additional meaning given by the predicate to the subject, right? Because if we're saying God's commands are good, what we're saying is God's commands are God's commands, which means nothing, right? So moral language under DCT becomes vacuous, it's empty. And right or wrong are just concepts determined by God arbitrarily. So when we say things like murder is bad and selflessness is good, what we're just saying is murder is forbidden by God and selflessness is commanded by God. And these sort of statements become meaningless for some, right? Because they're arbitrary as well. So this second horn, the idea that good is good just because God commands it, has several issues, as we've seen here. And so how do we get around this dilemma? For many, this effectively destroys DCT, but there could be a third horn. There could be a way to get out the dilemma that some theists have proposed. What if instead of God like just arbitrarily commanding good and it's sort of being something he just chooses and determines, what if good is not something that he arbitrarily chooses, but instead it is founded and grounded in his very nature? So God is by nature, by necessity, good. The Bible, for example, describes in 1 John God as love. So God, not as loving per se, but God's very nature is love. So who he is, his objective sort of nature, God himself, is love. And St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, argues that God's attributes are united in him. There's no distinction between his attributes. They are all one. And so, which is the idea of divine simplicity, right? So if that is the case, then it's not like God could have, commanded certain things that we consider wrong. Morality is grounded not necessarily in God's commands, but in God's nature. And so that's a possible way that a theist could sort of get around the Euthyphro dilemma, but some still find that unsatisfying, especially if we're going to say that morality is what God commands. So that's just an interesting reflection on that as well, I'd say. There are some other objections as well to divine command theory. Look at the pluralism objection first. So especially in more recent times where we have sort of a variety of religions in society, some argue that actually there are so many gods that are worshipped around the world. Maybe in this country, lots of people are Christians, but we also have Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and non-religious people, right? And if you go to other parts of the world, you'll have other religions, Shintoism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, all of these different gods and all these different religions. And we have all of these different deities that are being worshipped. So how do we know which one to follow and which God to obey? It's all very well saying, okay, morality is founded upon God and his commands. Which God? Which commands? How do I know? Effectively, which God's commands do we adhere to if DCT is true? Also, many gods give conflicting commands. So which one do I choose from? I can give the God of Christianity says this is right, whereas the God of Hinduism, or one of the gods of Hinduism, forbids this. Okay, well, which one is right? But even if we go with a specific God, let's choose the Christian God, there is a difference of interpretation as to what God commands within that specific religion. So Exodus 20 says in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not murder. But in Joshua 5 and 6, God commands the Israelites to kill the people of Jericho. Some think this is a contradiction, and they're unsure which of God's commands they ought to follow. Are they ought to follow Exodus 20, which is do not murder, or Joshua 5 and 6, kill the people of Jericho? There's the same God, but there seems to be different commands that are actually opposing. And also, if there is only one true religion and only one true God, some people believe there could be multiple, but many religious people believe that only their religion is true, or there is only one God, their God. Then those who are not believers in that specific God are incapable of being moral. But are we going to say that only people of one religious group or one religion are capable of acting in a good way? It would seem that people of all religions and all faiths can act in a good way, according to some. Or what about those who haven't heard of the true God? Can they be blamed if they don't follow God's commands? How do we even come to know what God's commands are? Do we need to read the Bible? Do we need direct revelation from God himself? Do we need some sort of way? How do we actually find out what God's commands are, right? It's easier said than done, in a way. And what about in this specific situation that I'm in, right? Especially under things like weak form of DCT. How do I know what God commands specifically for this circumstance? So there's a lot of questions here associated with this challenge. And some would see these as valid questions that proponents of DCT have to answer. In terms of whether or not this is an objection, though, it could be argued that, well, this doesn't really matter, because especially if we go with the first section, which says, how do we know which God's commands to adhere to, or how can there be one true God that we have to follow his commands and just ignore all the others? Well, it may just be the case that there is, and that all the others are wrong. That might be disrespectful to some people, but it may well be the case that there is only one God, and we can find his commands through the Bible or through Revelation or whatever, and that we ought to follow those. And that a religion which teaches against that, which has another God, is actually detrimental. It's not helping someone to act morally. Now, that answer for some is not satisfactory, and they think that's actually disrespectful. But that's one way that a theist could sort of get around that objection and say, well, I'm right, you're wrong, effectively. So that's worth keeping in mind as well if someone does raise this objection. And the last objection we're going to look at is the idea of poor moral motivation. So Michael Austin argues that, as per DCT, the primary reason that we are being moral, acting moral, is to avoid eternal torment in hell, effectively, right? Or at least for a lot of religions. So it's sort of, okay, God commands certain things, and then I ask, okay, why should I do that? And the response could be, so you don't go to hell. So that seems to be the reason or the motive as to why to act morally. Not necessarily, because some religious people would say they do it out of love, or they do it because it's the right thing to do. But for many, it will be to avoid hell. It would be to avoid eternal punishment in a place like hell or whatever. Instead of that, though, it seems a better moral motivation would be to act because of the intrinsic value of the act, or because of love, or because of some other reasons other than just to not go to hell, right? He also believes that the virtue of autonomy or personal choice and being able to make these decisions without external coercion and pressure, which some think having God and having him giving you commands produces, if we get rid of that autonomy, then we don't have proper moral decision making. So we need autonomy and free choice when it comes to making moral decisions. And if we do take that away, then it sort of means that we're forced to rely on someone else, and we're not able to think for ourselves and make moral decisions of our own volition. Now, the last thing we'll just have a look at is the modern version of divine command theory. So you might remember earlier that we mentioned a guy called Robert Adams, and he's come up with, especially in light of those criticisms, a modified divine command theory that is quite a recent development. So he was a 20th century philosopher, and obviously looking at his problems, he wanted to see, is it possible to rescue the traditional divine command theory? So he has some modifications to give. So the first thing that he says is, okay, what we have to just establish from the get-go is that God loves us. So if we remember the arbitrariness problem or the abhorrent commands objection, we've just got to bear in mind that God, if he exists, we're going to assume that he just loves us. I mean, he has our best intentions in mind. So this places emphasis now more on God's omnibenevolence, or his love for us, than in his omnipotence, which is what it was previously based on. So, although divine command theory, or the traditional version at least, defines wrong as contrary to God's commands, or, doing what God forbids, Adams adds an additional bit to that and says that actually God's commands are based on his love. So they're not arbitrary. So that's the way he gets around the arbitrariness problem, but they're based on his love. So he's introducing this idea of love as the foundation of his commands. So he's not just doing things, randomly. He's not just going to give a random sort of command that could be wrong. So that gets away the arbitrariness problem. And the reason that Adam says this is he says it's unthinkable. It's unthinkable for God to command something which we think is abhorrent, right? Because he loves us and he wants our greater good. He couldn't command something which is abhorrent. But he does realise an issue with that. He thinks it's still logically possible for God to command evil. But even though it's possible, it's so unimaginable and unlikely that we don't need to worry about it. Because we know that he loves us, and so therefore we can say with a great certainty and with great hope that all his commands will spring from his love, and they will be good. So, for some, this solves a lot of the issues associated with the classical divine command theory, and it places more evidence on God's love and how his commands are going to flow from that love, and so they're not going to be abhorrent or evil. But the only issue is that if God actually did command cruelty for its own sake, then the theory would dissolve, because Adams acknowledges that this is a possibility, and therefore if he were to do this, then how do we know that God loves us anyway? And also, what does it mean that God loves us? Well, someone could say that God wishes our good, but what does good mean? Then we go back to the issue of defining good, and many divine command theorists will say, well, commands, so we've got a circle, right? And so we've got to establish what is God's love and why is God's love. So we mentioned earlier the fact that maybe it's God's nature, and maybe Adams would agree that God's nature is, by necessity, by itself, is love. It is goodness, and therefore his commands flow from that, right? That's sort of what Adam's getting at. But some would argue that just saying, okay, God's commands are based on love, and love is just what is wishing the good for others, and the good is what God commands, is a circle. It's a tautology again. So there's an interesting development here that Robert Adams gives, but some are still not satisfied with it as fully developing and giving an answer to the issues associated with divine command theory, and they still see it as unsatisfactory. But those are the challenges in the new versions, and that's all we're going to look at today for divine command theory.